The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome. Thank you guys for joining us for today's webinar. Before we get started, my name is Christy Fitzgerald here with the Sprinklr team. I'm a solutions consultant here at Sprinklr. And before we get started, I have just a couple of items for us to cover. First, I want to make sure that you guys know we welcome your questions. Please, throughout today's webinar, feel free to ask questions. There's a Q&A option on the webinar control panel. We will address questions at the end of the webinar as time allows, and we will also make sure to follow up with any questions that you have to make sure you get the information that you need. Also, we invite you to download the resources that will be made available at the end of today's webinar. Those will also be able to be found in the download section of the webinar control panel. Now, before we get started, now that we've kind of covered off on that information, I do have a question for those of you who are on the webinar with us today. So real quick, if you wouldn't mind, right there in the webinar console, we would love to know what your role is within the organization. So real quick, if you can just go ahead and select the option that most closely aligns with your role, then we'll go ahead and give you guys a moment to answer. Perfect. And it looks like the majority of you today are social media directors or marketing directors and social media managers. So that's great. We have a great set of content lined up for you guys today that will, I think, really resonate with what you're trying to do. So now that we know a little bit about you, it's my pleasure to introduce to you today's presenter. Peter Weinberg is a brand strategist at LinkedIn, and LinkedIn is a key channel partner of Sprinklr's. We are so excited to be able to work, very closely with them to share best practices and ideas that help our clients. So Peter is going to walk us through 7 emerging trends in B2B marketing, and our hope is that you'll find, fresh ideas that you can leverage to drive your own B2B marketing forward in 2017 and beyond. And so with that, Peter, I'll go ahead and hand it over to you.
Yep, thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks all for joining. I know there was stiff competition with Mr. Comey testifying in front of Congress. I guess we're competing with that, so thank you for choosing me over him, although actually that may be over. I've been in meetings for a few hours. But anyway, my name is Peter Weinberg. I work on our brand strategy team, so it's our role to kind of try to bring fresh thinking to our most important partners and clients. And that is why I'm here today. Here is a giant picture of my face for you guys all to look at. So we're going to talk about 7 trends today, and these are not kind of future-looking trends. These aren't things that are going to happen in 5 to 10 years in B2B marketing. These are trends we're starting to see in market today. Some of these trends are based on research we've done. Some of them are based on third-party research, and some are just kind of observations that we've had after working with a lot of the top B2B marketers on the planet. And we've grouped these trends in a kind of sequential way. So it's not a random hodgepodge of trends. We're going to talk about them sequentially. So we're going to talk about them within the framework of this kind of traditional marketing framework. So we're going to talk about how to approach an audience, how to structure your creative, how to distribute that creative, and ultimately how to measure its effectiveness. 7 in all. Our first trend is around the true value of thought leadership. And true value is kind of the operative word here. The idea is that marketers have gotten a lot better at articulating exactly why thought leadership is valuable and how it drives business impact. But let's start with kind of the qualitative case for thought leadership. I think it's important to start with this observation that B2B buyers are scared. So there's this common misconception in the marketplace that B2B is super rational and that B2C is super emotional. So you buy a Coke because you feel like opening happiness. You buy IBM after, an entire year of meetings and research and 100 different conversations. And one is totally rational, the other is totally emotional. As this guy points out, John Miller, who's one of the founders of Marketo, you could actually, it's sort of the exact opposite. So you could actually make a pretty compelling case that B2B is much more emotional than B2C. And that's because the cost of a bad decision is much higher in B2B. So if you buy a can of Coke and you don't like it, it's fine, you throw it out, it costs you $1, not that big a deal. If you give a multi-million-dollar contract to the wrong vendor, to the wrong cloud computing vendor, that affects your career, which affects your livelihood and job security, which affects your family. So actually, there's a lot more on the line. There's a lot more riding on B2B decisions. So in many ways, emotions are actually running a lot higher. Hence this classic quote from my doppelganger, Don Draper, although it predates him, of course, the idea that nobody ever got fired for buying IBM. And the insight there is that B2B buyers are fundamentally risk averse. Nobody wants to get fired. You hire whoever will not get you fired. Thought leadership plays into this whole psychological dynamic because it de-risks the buying process. Thought leadership gives the buyer confidence that you actually know what you're talking about, that you're the foremost expert in whatever it is you're trying to sell. In a word, it establishes trust, which leads directly to sales. Trust is kind of the antidote to fear. So we've actually done some quantitative research on this. The research actually came out Monday. We did it in partnership with Edelman. You guys should check it out. Maybe you can Google it, or maybe we can follow up with it. But the research worked like this. We basically surveyed two groups of people. We surveyed people who create thought leadership, aka B2B marketers, and then we surveyed buyers, aka decision makers. And we wanted to figure out how exactly thought leadership drives ROI. And the first question we asked was about trust. We just talked about how trust de-risks the process. So among people who create thought leadership, around 50% of them say they think it builds trust in their organization. Among actual buyers, that number is more like 82 and 81%. So already you can see there's kind of a gap between how valuable marketers think thought leadership is and how valuable their buyers actually think it is. But trust is kind of a fluffy concept, right? Not a lot of us, trust doesn't pay the bills for a lot of us. I think what's more interesting perhaps is this stat. So this is about actual RFPs. So among people who create thought leadership, around 17% think it actually results in them getting more RFPs from potential clients. Among actual clients, the number is more like 37% and even higher among the C-suite, a very hard audience to influence. So it's about 2x higher. So in other words, thought leadership is about 2x more valuable than marketers think it is. And there's a lot of great data in this research that I think helps articulate how actually throughout the entire buying journey, thought leadership plays a pretty pivotal role in influencing sales, even more so than I think a lot of the traditional direct response tactics that are perhaps easier to measure, but not necessarily more effective. But there is a kind of problem here. The problem is that the simple desire to create thought leadership, so maybe you're now bought in on the value of thought leadership, maybe you've been bought in on it for quite some time. The simple desire to create thought leadership doesn't mean that you're going to be very good at it. And if you actually look at most of the research, it doesn't seem like anyone is very good at it today. So there is a sort of fundamental problem in the marketplace. There's a problem from marketers' perspective. So pretty much any survey you look at of marketers says they feel like they don't have enough content, they think the content they have isn't very good, they're not sure whether or not they're effective at content marketing, some combination of all three. And then if you actually look at buyers, this is some of the research again from that same study, you see basically about half of buyers are disappointed with the quality of the thought leadership they see. So some need is kind of fundamentally not being met. People are trying to create thought leadership, but they're not necessarily doing it in a way that is profitable to them. And we, my team, has started to ask ourselves why. Like, what explains the kind of sorry state of thought leadership marketing today? It doesn't seem to be for lack of trying, right? And we have a kind of conspiracy theory that I will share with you. And our conspiracy theory goes like this. It's that for the past 10 years or so, marketers have been told that they need to try to imitate newspapers. There's a certain logic to this, right? It's that you need to create a ton of content all the time that's very good. Who creates a ton of content all the time that's very good? Newspapers, like the New York Times. So brands have taken this very literally, and they've set up, brand newsrooms staffed by armies of brand journalists, and they're cranking out kind of lightweight, real-time content, 500, 750 word articles all the time, every single quarter, reinventing the content calendar from scratch. And that's how I think most marketers are going to market with thought leadership. The problem with trying to imitate the New York Times from our perspective is encapsulated pretty well in this depressing chart of the New York Times stock performance over the past 40 years or 30 years. The point here is that it's actually very hard to be a newspaper. It's hard to do that profitably at scale. You need an army of people. You need to be on the ground paying attention every second. The minute you publish your content, it actually immediately starts to lose relevance because it has to be real time, and there's unlimited competition. So, if the New York Times can't quite figure out how to make money being the New York Times, what is the likelihood that it's a great business model for IBM or Intel or, General Electric or any B2B heavyweight? Which brings us to our second trend. So consider that a cliffhanger, where I'm going to show you the kind of solution to that problem. The solution to that problem, we think, is this idea of content franchises, which is a fundamentally different way to go to market with thought leadership. The idea here is that there's one way to go to market is like the New York Times, with lightweight, real-time, short articles. An actually completely different way is the Hollywood model. So this is the New York Times, this is Hollywood. Walt Disney has succeeded where the New York Times is struggling, right? Their stock is hitting all-time highs. I think I'm just financially obligated to disclose that I may own some stock in Disney, so I'll go ahead and do that right now. It's only like 3 shares, so not a huge deal, but might as well buy if you get the chance. But the point is, what's really at play here? What explains Disney's success? And I think it really comes down to 3 things that are actually super important for all B2B marketers to understand. 3 things helping Disney become so successful. So take a look at Disney's content calendar. This is their content strategy. So just like your clients or you have a content calendar or content strategy, so does Disney. I think what you'll see here is a few different things at play. The first is the idea of focus. So if you had to guess in your head right now how many movies Disney made in 2016, take a minute and think about that. I think usually when I poll, most people say 40 movies, but the actual answer is 14. So Disney is actually making less and less movies every single year. They're making bigger and bigger bets on fewer and fewer things and pouring more and more resources into fewer and fewer things to make sure it really breaks through, laser focused. And because of that focus, they were able to make $6 billion on just 4 movies, which has never happened in the history of Hollywood. No studio has ever made $6 billion before. So there's something working here in terms of their focus. But the second principle, as important as focus, is familiarity. So if you actually look at a lot of these movies, you'll see that most of them are not really original pieces of content. They're all either remakes or sequels to things people have already heard of. They're things like Star Wars 7, right? Star Wars has been around since 1979. It's not a new asset, it's actually an old asset, and they're just doing it again and again and again. Actually, in the past 16 years, the top 15 movies have all either been remakes of old movies or remakes of books. The point here is that what's working for Hollywood is a focus on the back catalog, on things that have been proven to work, things that people have already heard of, things that have brand equity. And that's what Hollywood can do that newspapers can't. The New York Times, for all intents and purposes, does not have a back catalog. They can't go back into their back catalog, find an article from 1979 about Jimmy Carter, and try to remonetize it in 2017. That's not going to work. News has to be new by definition, right? Or else we would call it old. But very different in Hollywood context. Hollywood old is actually good. I mean, people know the story already, and people like things that they've heard already. Third principle is equally important to understand is extensibility. So easy to understand in Disney context. When Disney is lucky enough to have a franchise that everyone's already heard of, like Star Wars, that's successful, they don't just make it into a movie. They make it into a video game. They make it into a lunchbox, into an action figure. When new formats come out like drones, they just take the same IP and they move it into peripheral channels, right? But it's not new IP for different channels. It's the same IP in as many channels as possible. It turns channel complexity into a strength rather than a weakness, which I think is what it is for most marketers today. So a sort of fundamentally different approach. I think some cynical people have actually argued that Disney's movies are just advertisements for Disney World, which is just one gigantic advertisement for Disney's merchandise. But the point here is focus, familiarity, and extensibility. That's how Hollywood does it, very different from how newspapers do it. So where am I going with this kind of long, rambling metaphor of mine? Well, where I'm going with it is that just like those 3 principles work in Hollywood, they also work in B2B. You have B2B marketers who are monetizing their content like Hollywood and not like newspapers. And this is what that looks like. So I'll give you one example I'm very fond of, Mary Meeker's Internet Trends Report. So do any of you guys read the Internet Trends Report? I can't actually see or hear any of you, but in my imagination, all of you are raising your hands. And that's because the Internet Trends Report is a blockbuster. It's a smashing success every single year. First of all, it demonstrates focus because it is essentially all Kleiner Perkins does from a marketing standpoint. They just do internet trends. It's familiar because they do it every single year. People have heard of it. They come to expect it. I think it actually came out last Wednesday. It's already broken the internet. Every single year, it's the most viewed thing on SlideShare. It racks up over 10 million views on SlideShare. It's a familiar franchise, and it gets extended into many different formats. Mary Meeker takes it to conferences. It's a SlideShare. It spawns a million blog posts. There's probably Mary Meeker action figures for all I know. I don't know, but if there is, I'd really like to buy one. This actually gives you an example of how a more complex org does it. So Salesforce actually has a blockbuster for every single line of business where they make their money. So they have one for analytics, they have one for CRM, they have one for sales, and they do it every single year. So they're focused in terms of their marketing for each line of business, and they're familiar in terms of doing it year after year, and they extend it into many formats. This is sales, this is service. Our team, our marketing department has their own blockbuster. It's called the Sophisticated Marketer's Guide to LinkedIn, and it's been our #1 source of ROI for 3 years in a row. And because it's so valuable to us, it's not just this ebook, it's also a webinar, it's also a podcast and an infographic and a SlideShare. These are the B2B equivalents of action figures and lunchboxes in video games. They're different formats and different channels, but we're not developing different IP for all these different channels. We're using the same exact IP in as many formats as possible. This is how you actually use this whole strategy to drive ROI. I told you this Sophisticated Marketer's Guide. I didn't tell you it has our highest CTR or our highest or lowest cost per lead. I told you it has our highest ROI, which means we're able to attribute sales to this piece of thought leadership. And let's talk about how you do that. You have your blockbuster, your piece of thought leadership, heavyweight piece of thought leadership, and it lives on your site. You drive traffic there through these kind of ungated, lightweight pieces of content derived from the blockbuster, like a podcast on Monday, checklist on Wednesday, maybe a listicle on Friday, all of which lead back to the central asset. These kind of function like previews in Hollywood. In Hollywood, you don't say, hey, please buy a ticket for my space opera. You show 5 minutes of Star Wars to give people a sense of what the content's going to look like, and then that makes them a lot more likely to buy a ticket and consume the whole experience. So similar thing here, previews drive to the central asset. Then usually the asset is gated, which allows you to capture lead information, and you can then pipe those leads into your marketing automation system, nurture them, start telling them about your products and services until they actually become a customer. And then you can figure out how valuable a customer they were and attribute that revenue back to the piece of thought leadership. So at the top of the funnel, you're purely talking about topical expertise. At the bottom of the funnel, you've earned the right to talk about what your company actually does and what people should actually buy. There's another way to do this I should call out that is not gating, because a lot of research says people get very pissed off when they have to fill in a gate. So although it's an easy way to measure lead volume, it's not necessarily the most effective way. Another way is through pixeling and retargeting. So you could drive people to this blockbuster on your site. It could be pixeled, and then you retarget those people with product and service messaging until they become customers. It's a bit of a longer process and certainly involves some coordination, but ultimately it gets you better reach against your blockbuster than if you put it behind a wall, behind a gate. Our third trend of 7 is about touchpoint consistency. So I just told you you got to take the same IP and put it in a million different channels. But most marketers are still struggling with the idea of millions of channels. And they're getting smarter about how to control for one of the side effects of channel explosion, which is brand inconsistency, which can be pretty disastrous for a brand. Why is consistency even important? Well, this is really why. It's because no one remembers anything on the planet Earth anymore, and that's especially true of ads. So we see something like 5,000 ads a day. That number used to be 500 in 1970, so it's growing exponentially. And the end results are these depressing stats about brand awareness on the internet. So only around 14% of people can remember the last ad they saw. Only 8% of those people have any idea what company or product is being promoted. Only 3% thought it was relevant to them, which is actually an entirely separate problem, although certainly a problem. The point is, people are incredibly forgetful. They see so much information, they have to black most of it out. The cure to the situation, there is a solution, and it's pattern recognition, aka showing the same thing over and over again until people remember it. So we see this every day in the B2C and B2B world, especially in B2C. This is something consumer packaged good marketers have understood for a very long time. So if I show you this can, which I've removed the logo from, you can still identify the brand, hopefully. It'd be pretty weird if you couldn't, but I'm going to assume that you know that this is Coca-Cola, and that's because you've seen red and white and Coca-Cola probably since the day you were born. But B2B marketers are figuring out how to capitalize on the same effect, how to drive recall with pattern recognition, which is the cure to forgetfulness. So let me show you this chart. This is a chart from a marketing intelligence company. And if I were to ask you to tell me, I've removed the logo, what company produced this chart? So think in your head, you've seen so many millions of charts about digital marketing. Do you have any idea who produced this chart? Again, I can't see or hear you, but in my experience, I would say around 80% of people in the room can tell me that this chart came from eMarketer, which means that eMarketer has built an entire business off the back of pattern recognition. Every time they do a chart, it's black and red. It looks exactly like this. They don't mess with the formula of what their charts look like at all. And the end result is, when you think statistics about digital marketing, you'll think of the only brand who you really instantly remember and whose stuff you've seen over and over and over again, and that's eMarketer, right? Super powerful concept, very tactical but very powerful. So next time you put a chart in a newsfeed ad, which our clients do all the time, think, does it look like every other chart we've ever produced before? And if someone saw this chart with the logo removed, would they be able to correctly recognize it as coming from my company? One reason we like blockbusters is because it's a focused approach, and if you focus, it's much easier to guarantee consistency. When you're churning out 1 million articles a day and putting them in 1 million different channels, it becomes pretty hard to make sure that everything getting shipped out the door looks very custom and all looks exactly the same. EY is a best-in-class example of touchpoint consistency. They've invested in this pretty seriously. So this is their website, this is their blockbuster, this is their influencer post, this is their slide share, and this is their status update. So you'll notice right away, it's all black and yellow. It all has that trapezoidal thing, whatever that is. And the next time you see something that's black and yellow and has a trapezoidal thing on it, you'll know it came from EY. You'll remember that you once read something by EY and it was very good, and you'll become primed to click on it. And when you read the thought leadership, you'll remember to attribute it to the right brand. I think an underrated thing that probably happens today is, even if someone finds really great thought leadership, it's not that closely related to a brand visually, and they ultimately forget who they actually saw it from. Was it EY? Was it Accenture? Was it McKinsey? That's something that's not going to happen to EY because of how dedicated they are to all of their stuff looking exactly the same. So touchpoint consistency is how you build recall in a world of exploding channels. The fourth trend is around everyone as a marketer. So I just told you there's many different channels, but you could make an argument that not all channels and not all touch points are created equally. You could make an argument, in fact, that employees are the single most valuable touch point a company has. So if you look, for instance, at the Edelman Trust Barometer, which is a B2B blockbuster in its own right, you'll see pretty much every year it says the same thing, which is that people don't trust institutions. They don't trust faceless bureaucracies and corporations. They trust people like themselves. They trust peers. They trust subject matter experts. All content they want to flow through people like themselves, not through companies. And marketers are getting smarter about capitalizing on these dynamics. They're figuring out how to make sure their content is actually coming from employees in some way or another. And there's pretty powerful business impact to doing that right. So based on our data, obviously we're able to track employees, loop them back to a specific company, and figure out the kind of downstream impact. We've seen that trust that employees have translate into some of these business effects. So for instance, we've seen that the extended network of employees tends to be about 10 times bigger than the reach of a company page. So there's a massive opportunity just in terms of reach and impressions. But it's not just about impressions or sheer volume of impressions. It's that those impressions, because they came from people, carry a certain weight. And as a result, they deliver value in a way that other impressions don't. So you can see for all the impressions generated by employees, you get this valuable downstream activity like connections, which we'll talk about later, content consumption, job applications. It has some pretty amazing side effects that are good for the overall organization when stuff is coming from employees. So what do you actually do with this? Well, we see clients who are starting to develop a people-first strategy. And I mean that both on the front end and on the back end. On the front end, it looks like this. You have your subject matter experts or your executives sharing your thought leadership, for instance, on LinkedIn, on the platform, or on your blog, or whatever channels you're using. You do webinars about your content. And when you do webinars, you feature your brand characters on the right-hand rail, right? This whole idea of brand characters is interesting to us. Just going back to the entertainment industry metaphor, all great stories are character-driven. Star Wars has C-3PO and R2-D2, and I can name every character in Star Wars if anyone is curious about that in the Q&A. But the point is, your company also has brand characters, and they should be front and center delivering your message. I'll give you a super tactical example of this, by the way. We've done this webinar about B2B trends a few times. And when we invite people to it with an in-mail, which is one of our products, in-mails can come from either a corporation, they could come from LinkedIn, or they could come from a person, me. And we found when we invited people to this webinar, we found that the cost per recipient, the cost per registration was about 10x higher for the one that came from a company versus the one that came from a person. So massively better performance from things that came from a human being, me, I'm a human being, in case anyone's wondering, versus a faceless corporation, which would be LinkedIn, where I work. But this is all on the front end. On the back end, you need to actually distribute your content through employees. So your employees are featured and front and center in your thought leadership, but then when you're actually distributing it, you find ways to get it in the hands of your employees and to have them share it with their network. And there's a bunch of tech solutions popping up in the space that help companies do that. We have one called Elevate, but there are a few, and they help companies distribute content to their employees and enable their employees to easily share that content on a variety of channels. But that's leading with people. Our fifth trend is around the death of hyper-targeting, which is even more terrifying than it sounds. But we've talked a little about audience, we've talked a little about how to structure your creative, and now we're going to move more into distribution. So the story here around hyper-targeting is that overall brands today have become pretty obsessed with this whole idea of ad targeting. And this is partially our fault. This is partially digital's fault. Digital has sold itself on the false promise of zero waste. So we've gone out and told marketers, television is so wasteful, you reach so many people. Come to digital where you can reach exactly the right people using data. In a B2B context, you can reach exactly the CXO. I call it a false promise, of course, since I think, as a lot of us know, sometimes that data can be quite questionable. Sometimes it's kind of cookie-based stuff that fell off the back of a truck and got sucked into a DMP, and then before you know it, it's a CXO. But even if you're buying LinkedIn's data, which is first party, and dare I say the best B2B data set in the world, there's still a problem with hyper-targeting. And the problem is this. It's that hyper-targeting, not targeting, but hyper-targeting, excludes potential buyers. So if I were to create a deck on B2C marketing trends, which I wouldn't, but let's pretend I would talk about this article from the Wall Street Journal. So I don't know if any of you guys saw this article, but it basically said Procter & Gamble is massively scaling back targeting on Facebook. They're still spending the same amount of money on Facebook. They're just not going to Facebook for its data to hyper-target, moms in Cincinnati who like Love Actually. They're using it just as a reach play. And that's because they started to realize that using the data was ultimately driving up their costs, which was limiting their reach, which was limiting their sales. The correlation between reach and sales is something that's become increasingly proven out. There's a book called How Brands Grow by Byron Sharp, which has become the kind of gospel in CPG marketing. But you would be tempted as a B2B marketer perhaps to ignore what Procter & Gamble is doing. That's the ultimate B2C company. But actually, we would argue that the same principles are at play. The same reason why hyper-targeting is bad for Procter & Gamble means it's also bad for IBM, because hyper-targeting in B2B also drives up your cost, limits your reach, and limits your scale. So again, we're not talking about not using targeting. Obviously, in B2B, you need to reach a very particular set of people, different from B2C, so some targeting is of course necessary. But hyper-targeting is a problem. So think of targeting as a spectrum. Broad, everyone on the planet Earth; niche, CXOs at pharmaceutical companies with 10,000 employees. Today, this is what the targeting approach looks like in B2C and B2B. B2B has gone way too niche. B2C is incredibly, is sort of in the middle of the pack, probably targeting a little more than they need to. Both of these things need to move to the left. B2B targeters, B2B marketers need to be a little more strategic about their targeting. B2C marketers probably need to be trying to reach everyone on the planet Earth if they're selling a $1 bottle of soda. This is especially true in B2B because of this idea of buying committees. So an endless amount of research confirms that no buying decision is made by a single individual. It's made by actually more and more people every single year. More and more cross-functional people weigh in on buying decisions every single year. There's this sort of extended buying committee. So if you're just targeting the CXO in the pharmaceutical industry at big companies, you're missing all the people who inform the CXO as to what they should do, the people who do research, implementation, people whose opinions get asked in finance, in operations, in product, all different parts of the org. And there's another nuance to this around junior decision makers. So a lot of people today, a lot of clients ignore junior people. So they'll use, for instance, LinkedIn's targeting to reach managers plus, and anyone who's less than a manager in seniority gets excluded from the campaigns. The issue, and it may sound kind of obvious, is that junior people don't stay junior people for long. If there's one thing I can say with 100% confidence, it's that young people ultimately become old. And obviously, because we're LinkedIn, we have a pretty interesting line of sight into how this whole thing happens. So for instance, in tech, we've seen that around 18 people weigh in on a given buying decision. And a lot of the junior people who are today excluded from most campaigns, a lot of those people become senior people in less than 3 years. Around 30% of junior IT people become senior decision makers in less than 3 years. So if you're trying to build a brand for the long term, and I think we all are, then you need to think not just about today's buying committee, but tomorrow's buying committee. And that can really only be done by casting a wider net, by not hyper-targeting, and by willing to accept maybe a slightly more waste so that you can reach more of the right people at a better price point. Sixth trend, our penultimate trend, is around brand investing, principles of brand investing. So digital has always sort of been the wild, wild west. You know, we all have emotions or feelings about exactly how you should, allocate budget and that kind of thing. But increasingly, marketers are getting more scientific about this and figuring out what are some kind of ironclad, research-backed rules I can apply to my media campaigns, my media buys. And these are 3 rules we'd like to get your thoughts on. So the first one is the 60-40 rule. It's based on this study, the long and the short of it. This is a 30-year longitudinal study of about 10,000 brands, and it started to group brands into overperformers and underperformers. And what they found is that overperforming brands spend about 60% of their budget on brand building, thought leadership, awareness, and then spend 40% of their budget on commercial activation, buy now, that kind of thing. So the balancing act is something like 60-40 between that top of the funnel and the bottom of the funnel. And I think this looks very different from how things are today. I think at least in digital, it's more like a 10-90 rule, where 10% of the budget goes towards thought leadership and trust, 90% goes towards commercial activation, buy now, buy now, buy now. And this suggests that maybe we need to swing things back in the other direction, and sort of dovetails nicely actually with what we were saying about the true value of thought leadership. The second rule is around the 10-to-1 ratio. So the idea here is that it's become incredibly competitive to distribute content. Unfortunately for all of us, having great content is certainly not enough to make sure it gets seen. So I think it's interesting in the Disney context. So let's go back to Star Wars. Star Wars is the most well-known piece of content in the history of the human race. There's pretty much no one who has not heard of Star Wars. And yet, Disney spent well over $500 million advertising Star Wars in traditional media with these crazy brand integrations like an X-Wing picking you up, in Uber integration. The point is, if Disney has to spend that much money to market something everyone has already heard of, think of how much money you probably have to spend in order to make your unfamiliar franchises familiar. Obviously, no one wants to hear that they need to spend a ton of money on distribution, but unfortunately, there's probably no other way to break through in a pay-to-play world. And we think a lot about this 10-to-1 ratio, and this is how we generally allocate our budget. So for every dollar you spend on creative, you spend $10 on distribution. And I actually think the blockbuster approach, and that allows you to bring down some of your content production costs through focus and put more money into distribution, which is how you reach customers and actually drive customers. So something to think about as you figure out how to play the balancing act, not just between brand and lead, but between content and distribution. The third and final rule is the 80-20 rule, also known as power laws, also known as power dynamics. Been around a long time. I think it was a Italian philosopher or economist who came up with this. The Pareto principle it's called. And the idea is that actually in like pretty much all walks of life, there's this weird rule that 80% of your value will come from 20% of your things, whatever that is. So in the Italian economist example, it was that 20% of the peas were producing 80% of the, 20% of the pea plants were producing 80% of the peas. In the world of content, very similar thing at play. So for instance, 95% of revenue in the music industry goes to just 5% of the artists. That's power law distribution. Very well understood concept in VC. So that's what we're looking at here. The idea is that, you know, firms like Andreessen Horowitz know that most of their investments are going to flop, but 20% will deliver 80% of their returns, and that's okay. So there's actually an easy way to apply this content marketing that can deliver pretty profound results. Today, you see a lot of clients treat all of their content equally. If they have $100,000 in 10 pieces of content, they'll spend $10,000 distributing each piece of content. But if you think about power laws, you'd recognize that the vast majority of your content, however good you think it is, the vast majority of it will either flop or be mediocre. But some of it, 20% of it, will be truly exceptional. And so marketers are starting to figure out how to budget accordingly so that they can capitalize on power dynamics. So what you would do in a power dynamic world is you'd have $100,000 in 10 pieces of content. You'd spend only $10,000 A/B testing those 10 different pieces of content. And then once the winner emerges, once the two winners emerge, as they inevitably will according to power laws, you take 80% of your budget and heavy it up on the top performing piece of content. So it's about not treating all your content equally. It's about making really, really big bets on the stuff that starts to work. And that's the 80-20 rule. Our final point is around measurement. Our final trend we call the case for cost per connection. The point here is that I think most of us know intuitively that a lot of the marketing metrics we count today don't necessarily actually correlate with revenue or purchase intent. To quote my grandfather, Albert Einstein, just kidding, he's not my grandfather, but that'd be awesome. Not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. By the way, apparently Albert Einstein never said this, so it's kind of fake news, but a lot of people think he said it. The point is, if Albert Einstein were a marketer, he might say CTR can be counted, but it doesn't necessarily count. It doesn't necessarily actually correlate into revenue. And we find that a lot of marketers are starting to realize this and starting to think good measurement needs to reflect the offline world. It needs to be the correlation between an online behavior and an offline behavior. So in a B2C context, this work Facebook did with CPG marketers is very interesting. They did this with data logic. So they would say, we're going to correlate online ad exposure with in-store sales. And they found how those things were correlated. So that's converging an online data metric with an offline metric sales. But that's very B2C. There's never really been a B2B equivalent, which is unfortunate because you could argue even more so B2B is offline. Right? I mean, most B2B sales happen on the golf course, in a meeting, over fancy cocktails in Midtown, wherever it is. It's actually even more offline. So we've been trying to think about what is a metric that actually has some predictive power in terms of offline results. And one thing we've become obsessed with, and a lot of our clients have too, is this idea of connection density. So what is connection density? Connection density, very simply, is the degree of overlap between two different groups of professionals. So think of all the salespeople in your company and all of their prospective clients, and how much overlap there is the level of connection density. At a macro level, this has been proven to result in money. So this is research. This is our economic research that we do every quarter, and it basically shows metropolitan areas that have more connected workforces have faster GDP growth. But we've also seen at the micro level, clients like Accenture, General Electric have seen that if they can increase connectivity between their salespeople and their prospective clients, they get more money. So connections actually a very strong predictor of revenue. If you can manage to create connections or increase connection density between your sales force and your prospective clients. And the good news is, especially with account-based marketing, one of the most useful but unmeasured side effects of marketing is connectivity. And we see this every day with our data. So this is an example of sending an email, an invitation to connect, from someone who didn't see any advertising. The thing on the left, they're about 16% likely to respond and engage with the sales force. If you expose them to content, if you run an account-based marketing campaign to all of those prospective clients and then have your sales force reach out to them, there's about 150% lift. You get to 40%, which, fun fact, is about 14 times higher than the average email response rate. This is for InMail, sort of subtle but shameless plug for our InMail product. The point is, marketing creates connectivity for sales forces, and connectivity is a leading indicator of ROI. So we have clients who are using our data to track connection density and growth in connection density after they run account-based marketing campaigns. Obviously, some work needs to be done to make sure this is more automated. Right now, it's a sort of super custom, clunky thing. But increasingly, since marketers are seeing the value and how it translates into ROI more so than things like CTR, I think you'll start to see a lot more marketers measure this or things like this. So I think that's pretty much our show. We do want to talk to you about how you can actually take advantage of these trends, how you can actually take action on them so that they're not purely theoretical. And I think I'm going to turn it over to my friends at Sprinklr now to walk us through that.
Okay. Perfect. Yeah, so just gonna swap this here and make sure that you guys are all able to see my presentation. So, thanks so much, Peter. This was really great information for our webinar audience. I'd like to recap these 7 trends and actually talk about how those of you on today's call can personally take advantage of some of those trends in your marketing strategy today. Before we do that, a quick poll question. So I'm going to pass this out to you guys. I'd love to know which of these emerging trends you guys found the most interesting. So I only had 5 options here. So went ahead and put those in. If you guys can actually go ahead and respond, I'm interested to see. I combined a few of those. We'll give you a few moments to vote on which of these you guys found the most interesting. And lots of votes are still coming in. So we'll give that another minute. Okay, and I'm going to share the results here for you guys. And it looks like, the thought leadership, touchpoint consistency kind of led the charge here. Also the targeting distribution. So that's great information. Thanks so much for letting us know. I think that's really great confirmation of what we were looking at. So the first trend we talked about is the need to really invest in thought leadership because it actually drives more business value your way. LinkedIn is incredible at providing data that really tells you guys what topics you need to own. Thought leadership is, essentially all about that topical expertise, and they have great data about what those topics are, what different groups of professionals are actually interested in or care about. I would also say, with Sprinklr listening for conversation starters or listening across millions of social channels about what's resonating with your audience, what's trending, where their passions lie. So for instance, if you're Cisco, for example, and you're trying to shift into more of a services offering, you may want to understand what are people saying about the Internet of Things and see where you can weigh in with your expert opinion. So content marketing, again, just being able to actually pull in and organize all of the content that you're planning from beginning to end. These are the types of things that we see our B2B clients really doing successfully, and some ways that you can actually implement that, in your own organization. The second trend that we talked about is really building out your content franchise, or as Peter described it, that blockbuster. The idea of being able to create that thought leadership, and that thought leadership shouldn't be 10 million ephemeral articles. It should actually be heavyweight content that comes out every single year. So here's where we're investing, and I think LinkedIn is investing in this from the standpoint of they actually offer what they call blockbuster as a service. So where they actually have figured out that there are 16 different steps required to launch a blockbuster, and they're starting to do that work for and with clients, with their partners. Sprinklr also can help in regards to this, just by giving you a true way to tag and track all of the performance of that blockbuster content across all of your social channels. So I think it's great when you start to put that blockbuster content together and then really think about how do you measure and actually validate the performance of that content across social channels, across the different areas where you're executing on it. And then the third trend was around touch points. When you build a blockbuster for clients, ensuring that it fuels that touch point consistency. Peter mentioned, if we have all of that content and then we're distributing it in so many different places, in order to really drive recall in a world where no one is remembering things, we really want to think through how you would leverage technology to help make this possible. So another, way that Sprinklr can really help with this is to be that go-to solution for creating touchpoint consistency. You're able to really support your content distribution across more than 23 social channels, as well as plan for non-digital content and delivering clear, consistent messaging, and really allow the team to streamline that content orchestration and collaboration. And then the fourth trend was around employees. And as you generate that content, or as you're really empowering your employees to be your spokesperson and really get the word out and create that conversation around your content, both Sprinklr and LinkedIn have great employee engagement tools to help you promote employee advocacy. So this is another area where when you think through your efforts by delivering content to your employees through their employee advocacy solution, or through Sprinklr Engage employee advocacy solution, your on-brand thought leadership and blockbuster content can be easily accessed and shared by your employees on their own LinkedIn accounts, as well as other social channels as well. And then once you've, again, packaged up your thought leadership or your blockbuster content, thinking through targeting. Again, we talked about not using data to hyper target, but really using it instead to reach the entire buying committee. Leveraging, LinkedIn, and Sprinklr to target the right audiences across all of your social advertising in a way that's very strategic, but also flexible, right? So that you can target in a way that, doesn't limit your flexibility and gives you the tools to really optimize in real time what it is that you're doing across the social advertising space. And then the sixth trend we talked about was really around the law of distribution. So when we run paid media campaigns, when we make sure those campaigns are going out, and we want to make sure that they adhere to these principles, Sprinklr can really help brands very easily identify and achieve this type of ad spend optimization in real time, with the added benefit of automation, being able to actually take real-time information and make this scalable across all of your social advertising channels, including LinkedIn. So really, again, just being able to be very nimble with shifting ad spend, whether it's between A/B testing or shifting based on key metrics and optimizing across all of your channels. And then finally, we have cost per connection, and what Peter was talking about, a new metric that is very predictive of revenue. So, when they're looking at tracking this from a LinkedIn perspective and delivering that, reporting that shows how connectivity increases as a result of that account-based marketing campaign. When we think about how do we translate that into all of your ad spend, just making sure that we're really helping you track the return on that ad spend and linking it all the way through to conversion in a B2B environment. So thank you. Thank you so much for your time. If you would like someone to contact you with more information about Sprinklr, or if you had any questions about how we can help support your B2B marketing efforts, obviously you can always visit us online or email us. I think the email address will come back up on the screen in just a moment. But you can also go ahead and select in the poll if you do want someone to contact you with more information about any of the information that you saw on today's webinar. Please do feel free, let us know in the poll here, and then we can make sure to get you that information. And then I think we have, Peter, just a few moments for Q&A. So let me go ahead and close this poll out, and we will look online here and see what questions we have had come in. Okay, so one of the questions that came in, Peter, I think would be great if I throw it your way, but was how would you respond to marketers who say hyper-personalization is worth the expense because it generates more qualified leads and higher conversions? Any thoughts on that from that perspective? Peter, we might have lost you, or you might be on mute.
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. How awkward. I was in the middle of my brilliant answer, too. You guys missed half of it. I'll start from the beginning. You can hear me now, right?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, perfect. The point of hyper-targeting is that, let's say you're using 8 different targeting layers instead of 1. So you're using seniority targeting, plus functional targeting, plus industry targeting, plus company size targeting, stack all these things on top of each other. The likelihood that you can personalize creative to all 8 facets, I think, is very unlikely. I've never seen a client who can really do that. So for me, it's about which of those facets is most guaranteed to create creative relevance. So for instance, functional targeting is what you do within an organization. And obviously you're going to speak very differently to IT people versus salespeople, right? So you can choose that targeting parameter and personalize your creative based on that. But it's about being super strategic about which of these parameters is most important, because if I start stacking all of them on top of each other, my costs go up way too much. You could, I suppose, you could have super personalized creative for 1 million different niche audiences, and maybe through relevancy algorithms that could be cheaper than casting a broader net. But I think I have never seen a client who has the resources or bandwidth to personalize a piece of creative for 1 billion different niche audiences. I think actually the incremental cost of personalizing creative to that degree cancels out any potential ROI benefits. So for my money, you still use targeting, but you use bare minimum targeting, whatever will make the creative relevant without increasing your media costs overall.
Perfect, thanks. Another great question that came in regarding thought leadership, and I'll let you take this one as well. I have a couple thoughts here too, but they asked, what's a good way to identify topic theme if there's already an overabundance of thought leadership content available in your industry?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that's really where data comes in, and I think there's many different data inputs you can use to figure out what kind of thought leadership to create. There is third-party data sources, third-party from a client's perspective. So for instance, the LinkedIn data can tell you, okay, you want to reach people in the oil and energy industry, here are the topics they care the most about, and which ones are kind of gray spaces that you could potentially own. Then you have other data sources like search. So if everyone is searching for an answer to a particular question, like a niche question about cloud computing implementation, and you don't see a great answers rising to the top, it's not too competitive, that's a place to make your best in terms of content creation. And then you have your back catalog. So we talked a lot about trying to look into your back catalog and do the same thing every year instead of creating something from scratch. So you can look through your own analytics to figure out what is your highest performing piece of thought leadership, and can I now double down on that and do it year after year after year. So long story short, it's a combination of data sources from different platforms and data sources, from your own analytics dashboards that I think can give you pretty good directional information as to what type of thought leadership you should create.
Great. And then I think, I'll add to that a little bit, just thinking through how you can leverage data from a listening perspective across maybe different audiences that you're targeting, and understanding really what's of interest to them, and using it in a meaningful way that will allow you to change the conversation, right? Differentiate or add a spin to maybe the thought leadership that's already out there that's very unique to your point of view. And then finding the thing that will resonate as you do that. I think these are the kinds of trends that you can start to surface in order to help do that and drive that, content creation forward in that way. So I think, let's see, we have time for one last question here. Someone else on the call asked if we had any other resources for B2B organizations that we could point out outside of these marketing trends. So I'll start here, but I think it's a great question. I know at Sprinklr, we partner with many B2B businesses as their customer experience platform. I talked about quickly in our recap some of the key use cases or ways that we can help do that as it related to the trends that Peter was sharing. But beyond that, I think there are several ways that we support B2B clients at Sprinklr personally. And we do have some great resources that you could download in regards to this as it relates to B2B with their social and digital strategy. Specifically, the things that come to mind are around PR and marketing. We touched on some of that today, social selling, customer care, and advocacy. So we talked a little bit again about the PR and marketing support today, really helping organizations like yours streamline content, that content chaos with digital asset management, multi-channel content planning. There are some great resources available at sprinkler.com around that. For social selling, though, this is one we didn't talk about, but some great examples here. A really well-planned social selling strategy can have a huge impact on revenue generation and on brand reputation. And I think getting to know your customers on a really personal level, engaging with them, applying insights to personal and traditional marketing activities. Several examples that we could walk through, but two brands that come to top of mind for me here are Cisco and Nimble Storage. So I wasn't prepared for that question. I don't have the resources in the download window here for you, but you can find those resources specifically on social selling on our website. So I can also send those your way specifically. Who asked that question? I'll send those your way specifically after the call today. But I think those are some key ways that you can kind of look for some different resources. I'm sure, Peter, you may have some additional resources as well around B2B marketing outside of just these trends that we talked about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have research resources in the measurement front. We have audience resources, insights analysts who can help pull data. We obviously have dedicated account teams who can coordinate both of those things and help people, get campaigns live. And then I think of my team as another potential resource. So you guys can definitely connect with me on LinkedIn, reach out. Happy to talk to you about ways we could support you.
Perfect. And then I think that brings us to the top of the hour. So thank you for your time. This presentation will be provided to you after the webinar today via recording, via email. So you will have that again to reference after the call today. Thank you so much, and we hope you have a great afternoon.